Hello, I'm Claire Smith and welcome to my channel. So today I'm going to be talking about the concept of perfume clones, clone fragrances. And this video was really prompted by a couple of suggestions from various people who watch my channel. So thank you so much to Cat Jack, particularly, for suggesting this fragrance video. I would also like to say that Happiness Sparkles here on YouTube, Francis, also inspired this video by gifting me a fragrance from Dossier. She gave me Ambery Cherry, or Oriental Cherry as it was formerly named before Dossier decided to rename it. So yeah, her giving me this clone fragrance just made me want to make this video because I've never tried a clone fragrance before. I'd never even thought to buy a clone fragrance before, and I just thought, why not make a video about, the legalities of it, and also how they're made, and really what I think morally about making clone fragrances. So if this kind of content interests you, then please consider subscribing if you haven't done already, and also please like this video if you do find this kind of content interesting. I'm Claire Smith. I make videos all about perfume science, the social side and aspects of fragrances, and also I just do some straight perfume reviews as well. So if that kind of thing interests you, please subscribe, join me. So clearly this video is not sponsored in any way. I don't have any associations with Dossier. I don't think even Dossier sell fragrances in the UK, but I was really intrigued to try this. And when I looked up Dossier fragrances online, I realised the enormous price difference between this fragrance and the original, which is Tom Ford's Lost Cherry. So Tom Ford's Lost Cherry in the US will sell for $349 for 50 ml. And Dossier's version sells for $49 for 50 ml. So I see why people might want to choose the dupe fragrance, the clone fragrance, over the original. But what are the other considerations in choosing a clone over the original? But firstly, let's define what we mean by a clone fragrance, and really what is the difference between that and a fake or counterfeit fragrance or an inspired by fragrance. So let's start off with the lowest of the low, the counterfeit or fake fragrance. This is the one that is actually illegal. It's basically the people making them don't particularly care what they smell like, because all they care about is what they look like. They need the boxes to look like the real deal, they need the bottles to look like the real deal, and they just need to make sure that the branding and everything on the outside of the fragrance is going to make the consumer convinced that they are real. Once it's bought and once it's opened, the seller is usually long gone, and actually you don't want to spray these on skin because they could contain absolutely anything. These are not regulated fragrances at all, and they can potentially be dangerous. So that's the counterfeit fragrance. In contrast, clone fragrances are the ones that are legal. These are the ones that are incredibly close to the original fragrance, but are made by a perfume house that is perhaps not creating its own original fragrances. It just copies other fragrances that are already successful and on the market, but it does this at a much lower price point. There are numerous fragrance houses that do this, so fragrance houses such as Dossier, Dupe, Be Layered, Alexandria Fragrances. In the UK, things like Perfume Parlour, Copycat Fragrances. All of those are things that just copy other fragrances and do so very successfully. Clone fragrances might also be known as dupe fragrances. So actually dupe stands for the word duplicate, but in British English, unfortunately, dupe has more negative connotations, and so people actually think of being duped. Being duped means to be tricked or to be deceived. So yeah, dupe means duplicate, not being duped as in British English. And finally, there are also inspired by fragrances. So what do I mean by those? I mean the ones where even designer fragrances actually that have been inspired by another one. So fragrances like Ariana Grande's Cloud is clearly inspired by Baccarat Rouge 540. Fragrances like Mont Blanc Explorer are clearly inspired by Creed Aventus. This is something that really nobody talks about, the fact that designers are also copying other designers all the time, and even copying niche fragrances all the time. But this is really the acceptable face of copying fragrances, really, in the main, in the fragrance industry. It's more accepted than clone fragrances. Another example of an inspired by fragrance would be something like Camera from Lattafa. So Camera is a fragrance that is supposed to smell a little bit like or be inspired by Angel Share, but actually when you look at the notes, it doesn't really look exactly like Angel Share, and it doesn't smell like Angel Share. It just has a feeling that is similar to Angel Share. So yeah, they're not the same, but they have some inspiration from the original fragrance. So next, what makes clones legal as opposed to illegal? If they're copying fragrances, how is that allowed? Well, I guess this one really hinges around the laws around copying fragrances, which are really not that existent. So smells are really not tangible things like, say, a designer handbag is something tangible, or some designer clothing is tangible. It's something that is perceived differently by different people. It's something that is really quite a struggle to protect. It's difficult, if not impossible, to copyright a smell. And actually, there are very few cases that have been brought successfully by companies against others who have been copying their fragrances. The oldest example dates back to 2000. So there was a Dutch company called Kofa, and they had made a fragrance called Female Treasure. Lancome noticed this. They made a fragrance called Trésor. In fact, they still do make Trésor. And they realised that Kofa were actually trying to copy Trésor. And actually in 2000, Lancome tried to sue Kofa for using the name Female Treasure, because they said that people could be confused because Trésor in French actually means treasure. The Dutch courts actually disagreed with Lancome and came down on the side of Kofa, saying that people wouldn't be confused by this name because it's completely different, it's in a different language. But actually Lancome persisted, and actually in 2006, when Dutch laws had changed slightly, Lancome brought another case against Kofa. They retried making that claim against the brand name, but they also tried to claim infringement of their intellectual property about the smell. This time, the Dutch court upheld the claim, but not because of the brand name, because of the smell. So the Dutch court maintained that the smell of Lancome's fragrance was distinctive, it was perceivable, and it bore the stamp of the perfumer. It had been developed. Lancome had oodles of detail about how Trésor had been developed, and Lancome had even gone as far as to analyse female treasures, and had checked and found that 24 out of 26 fragrance ingredients were identical to the ones in Trésor. Dutch law really was all about the fact that those fragrances smelt the same. They didn't have to use the same ingredients. That wasn't the important thing for the Dutch law. The thing with the Dutch law was like looking at a book and seeing the contents of the book being the same, but the pages of the book being different. They were looking really at the overall perception of the fragrance by the end consumer. And if an end consumer couldn't tell the difference, if an end consumer thought they were the same thing, then the Dutch court judged the fragrance to have infringed upon Lancome's rights. This case was actually surprisingly unusual because only 3 days prior to this judgment by the Dutch court, a French court had ruled against L'Oreal. A French court had ruled that Dior's Dune fragrance wasn't copyrightable, and that was because the French court claimed that perfumers are not artists. They are more like craftsmen. So they are people like carpenters or like plumbers. They aren't artists, and therefore their work is not protected. In the whole history of fragrance, there are very few examples where fragrance companies have successfully defended their property. A more recent case was one that was brought against a Spanish company called Equalenza in 2018. So Equalenza was copying fragrances by Gucci, Hugo Boss and Lacoste, but it was also branding the fragrances with very similar logos, and that was really how it was got. It wasn't really the fact that they were copying the fragrance, it was how they were presenting the fragrance. Similarly, L'Oreal brought a case against a Belgian company called Bellure in 2006 as well, and L'Oreal were upset with Bellure because Bellure were copying L'Oreal's fragrances. So they were copying Trésor again, they were also copying Miracle, and also Noah, and also Anaïs. And actually, the thing that was upsetting L'Oreal was the fact that Bellure were taking the prices of the L'Oreal fragrances and writing them out in comparison to their own prices and saying how they were much cheaper and also how they were better. And that's really how L'Oreal won that case, because the European Court of Justice said that that wasn't fair to L'Oreal. So I'd say here, even if most legal challenges are not upheld, I would say that most perfume clone brands have probably come across some kind of cease and desist or just letters of concern from brands. I think it would be unusual if a clone brand, if a dupe brand hadn't come across these problems. And actually there have been cases from the UK where fragrance houses such as Chanel have tried to disable perfume dupe brands, perfume clone brands, by stopping their payment systems in general. And that is actually a really effective strategy in the short term to really frighten brands into thinking more deeply about what they're doing. But the irony is that most of the brands that had been threatened in that way or had had their payments blocked, even temporarily, still sell Chanel dupes. I guess these cases prompt a few questions. So how close does a fragrance have to be considered a copy? Also, if a fragrance is copying a fragrance that is discontinued, is that okay? With 6,000 fragrances being released every single year, what is an original fragrance? Surely everything is a copy or an inspiration of something else. Also, what could be protected? You know, if there were to be a law, could you protect the smell of a rose, for example? Surely there has to be some kind of input or creation for it to be an individual and unique fragrance. So in reality, if a fragrance brand can't copyright its perfumes, how does it go about protecting its property? So you might think that it would be easy to patent the formula of a fragrance, but actually perfume houses are very reluctant to do that because one, it costs a lot of money. It's also incredibly complicated and it requires the fragrance house to prove that the formulation is unique. It also requires the fragrance house to disclose the formulation, and a lot of fragrance houses don't want to do that. That would also be public knowledge as well as soon as the patent was out there, but obviously people wouldn't be able to use it. You would need to register the patent in many different countries as well, which would also be a massive headache and very, very costly. Also, a patent requires somebody to be solving a problem or to have some kind of unique characteristic. And I'm not sure a fragrance can effectively solve a problem. So you might say that a fragrance could be mood lifting or something, but you would have to prove that. Another problem with patents is that they only last 20 years. And after that time, the knowledge of the patent and the information held within the patent becomes public knowledge, and actually anybody can then make that fragrance in a kind of free-for-all after that 20-year period is elapsed. So they have a time limit. And okay, these days, probably most fragrances will not be on the market for 20 years, but say you have a hit, say you have an angel on your hands, maybe your fragrance will be on the market for more than 20 years and you want it protected. So what can a fragrance house effectively protect with trademarking? Well, it can trademark the bottle, it can trademark the box, it can trademark the design, it can trademark the logo or the branding. And actually, with perfume, the bottles are really a massive part of its recognition. Overall, perfume brands will try to trademark every aspect of a fragrance in order to protect it. The fragrance house also might trademark the advertising used and the slogans used in advertising the fragrance. And in that way, they can protect their property as much as possible. The beauty of trademarking is that it can be renewed every 10 years and it's ongoing. So it's something that doesn't have a time limit on it. And that is useful to fragrance houses more so than those 20-year patents. So in actual fact, is there any kind of precedent for protecting the smell itself? Well, no, not really, but there was one ruling by the EU back in 2015 that created the idea of olfactory trademarks. These trademarks were meant to be the first non-visual trademark, but actually there have been no actual olfactory trademarks granted within the EU. The only example I can see of actually trademarking any kind of fragrance was actually in the US. So Hasbro trademarked the smell of Play-Doh because they thought that that was a distinctive characteristic that distinguished Play-Doh from all other types of modelling clays and products for children. So really the conclusion of this is that most fragrance houses, most clone houses are very law abiding because there really aren't that many protections on the fragrance itself. Also, fragrance houses will be very careful not to infringe any of those trademarks. So they won't use branded bottles, they will use plain bottles, and they won't compare their own fragrances with the branded fragrance. They will be very, very coy sometimes about what they're actually duping and how close it is and the ingredients they're using because they don't want to upset the brands. So next, if clones are legal, then how are they made? Well, I think it would be very, very difficult for even a very skilled perfumer to just directly copy a fragrance by smelling it. What they really do in reality is they take a sample of the original fragrance and they use something called gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, to identify the fragrance molecules within that scent. And actually, that's really effective. So what happens is the sample is vaporized and it's given a charge, and individual compounds are identified by firing them through an electric field, and those charged compounds then deflect within that charged field. And the deflection is proportional to the size of the molecule and the charge of the molecule. So actually, things that are bigger will deflect less, and things that are smaller will deflect more. And in this way, you can use comparisons to databases of chemical formulae to be able to work back and find out what was in that original sample. And this is an incredibly successful way in which dupe houses have been finding out what's being used by perfumers to make various designer fragrances for really probably at least 10 years, maybe even more. The clone company will then construct a fragrance using those ingredients and will probably have some kind of perfumer or some skilled person then smell that fragrance and look over it and see whether they could tweak it to make it better or to make it have good longevity or to make it just smell a little bit more like the original fragrance. So if fragrance houses use this technology, why are they not always spot on? Well, actually, in a lot of cases, the fragrance molecules that are used by perfume houses are trademarked themselves, and they are usually exclusive in some form or another to particular fragrance houses, made and patented for them to be used exclusively. And that is a problem for dupe houses because they can't always access those ingredients in order to make something smell exactly the same. Also, some fragrance houses will rely on lots of naturals in their fragrances. It's not that common, but some fragrance houses do have naturals. So, for example, the Dior Privé line uses a lot of naturals in their fragrances. And that means that those things are not easily copied because they are not a single molecule. They are a mixture of maybe 10, maybe 100 different fragrance molecules that all come together to make that smell. And that's not something that you can just copy. You can't copy the scent of a rose by just putting in one compound. It's not going to smell exactly like a rose. It will smell similar, but it won't have those nuances. It won't have, it'll be like a painting that is only an outline, that kind of idea. It's not going to have the complexity that a natural would have. Next, why are perfume dupes cheaper? Well, I guess the most obvious reason is that dupe houses piggyback off the success of the original fragrance. They rely on the original fragrance house to market that fragrance, to make it known to the public, to create an image and brand for that fragrance, and to really create a buzz so they can feed off that popularity and use that popularity to sell their own fragrance with very minimal marketing. The original fragrance brand will have spent money on developing that fragrance, on consumer testing of that fragrance, and also may have employed a very eminent perfumer to make that fragrance in the first place. The clone brand will just copy it and will probably send a few free bottles to maybe some YouTubers to try and get some advertising for it, but ultimately won't spend a lot of money advertising their fragrance. Mainstream perfume brands also distribute their perfumes via stores, and that costs money. That requires distribution networks and connections and deals with stores. It also requires them to provide samples to the public in order to drum up interest in their fragrances. and also to provide testers at some kind of cut price to stores so that they can get people trying the fragrance and buying the fragrances. All of this costs money, which the perfume dupe brands, the clone brands, do not have to spend money on at all. Another thing that saves clone brands money is the very simple packaging. So for example, this Dossier fragrance comes in a very plain bottle with a very simple label that's not even put on straight, that still has wrinkles in it. It's a very poor quality look to this fragrance. Okay, it has a magnetic cap. It's a tidy fragrance, but it's not the best quality bottle. It's got, you know, a label I can peel off. It's very simple. It does the job, but it's very simple. Also, their outer packaging is very plain. It just comes in a very plain cardboard box. So again, they are saving a lot of money compared with designer fragrance brands. So next, if dupes are actually legal, are they morally okay? I guess this comes down to the consumer. It comes down to how you feel about clone fragrances. From my own personal point of view, I'm a scientist, and if I publish a paper, I do not expect another scientist to come along and publish a very similar paper in a different journal with my results and my ideas. That just wouldn't be on. I would expect them to reference me and to have some original work of their own. And I feel for perfumers in that respect because they don't have that protection. And I understand that perfumers could be upset by this, but I also think that perfumers could be kind of flattered because, you know, someone is bothering to copy your fragrance. I guess in contrast, clones at least do state in general what they've been inspired by, and therefore they do give some kind of credit almost to the perfume and the perfumer. I think it's interesting if we flip this and think of a fragrance from a very, very small niche brand or indie brand and think how we would feel about buying a clone fragrance of that. Something where they make very minimal profits, where they have very small batches, where perhaps they're a single trader. Would that still be okay? Because if it isn't okay, why is it okay to dupe and to copy designer brands? In contrast, why does fragrance cost so much? What is it about a designer fragrance brand that means that the price point is so much higher? Clearly, there are costs to the advertising, to the development, etc. But really, do designer fragrance brands need to charge £100 plus for a 50ml fragrance? I don't think they do. I think they are somewhat profiteering from people's love of fragrance. And that's where dupe brands, clone brands can come in and undercut them. And I guess this is kind of the great leveler of fragrance, really, because so many people who would never be able to afford the original fragrance can now afford to smell something very, very similar in a clone fragrance because of the undercutting of clone fragrance brands. It really makes you wonder, if fragrance brands charge less, would dupe brands still exist? If they couldn't undercut by the huge margins they do undercut fragrance brands by, would those brands actually still be successful and be in business? I actually severely doubt it. If fragrance brands cut their prices by half, would we still have this huge dupe market worth hundreds of millions of dollars? So next, do we think that dupe brands actually help or hinder original fragrance brands? I think that actually imitation is one of the biggest forms of flattery, and really it says you've made it, doesn't it, as a perfumer, if your fragrance is being copied and if your brand is being copied by a clone brand. It means it's popular, it means people want it, and it also pushes the name out there. How much is our knowledge of Baccarat Rouge and of Credo Ventus hinging on the fact that there are so many dupes out there, that probably most people will have tried a dupe of one of those fragrances, but they may not have tried the original fragrance itself. And that really gets the knowledge of how that fragrance smells out to the wider public and gets that fragrance brand name better known. It's a great form of advertising for fragrance brands. In reality, there's probably going to be a huge split between the people who will drop £300 on a Maison Francis Coq de Jam fragrance and the people who will only spend $49 on a Dossier fragrance. I think also people buying a clone fragrance might be doing so because they are considering the original fragrance and they can't get a sample at a reasonable price. What would you do? Would you buy a fragrance sample for maybe $30 with shipping? Or would you just buy a dossier fragrance and try that out for a while at $49 for 50 ml? I think I know what I would do. And ultimately, I think if you really love a fragrance, you will probably go to the original brand in the end and buy that, because you will want to know how that smells. You will get curious about it and you will think, wow, if this dossier smells this good, what does the original smell like? I think clones can also be really useful for people who are just starting out in their collections, or for people who have larger collections. Because if you're just not sure about your perfume tastes or how often you would wear something, having a clone fragrance and being able to live with it for a while can really sort out in your mind whether you need that in your collection or not, and whether you're comfortable with that fragrance profile or not. And that can be really useful. I guess the flip side of this is, if you've tried that dossier fragrance or the clone brand fragrance and you've loved it, why would you then go to the designer fragrance or the niche fragrance? I guess it's all about status, isn't it? It's all about what you think about a fragrance and whether that bottle or that packaging is important to you. You know, nobody knows whether you're wearing a clone or whether you're wearing the original unless they see the bottle, do they? It's something that is only really important to the wearer as to which version of the fragrance they have and whether they're comfortable with that. And actually how close that dupe fragrance or the clone fragrance is to the original when you've smelt it. You might actually smell some kind of nuance in there or some kind of complexity that really gives you a different feeling. And really, I think that's where clone brand fragrances and original fragrances might be slightly different. So I think that when I compare Dossier's Oriental or Ambery Cherry to Tom Ford's Lost Cherry, I think I smell more complexity in Tom Ford's Lost Cherry. I think I smell slightly different things. I think the cherry smells a little bit deeper. I think the cherry's a little bit more interesting in Tom Ford's Lost Cherry. I can't really put my finger on it, how it's exactly different. But to me, those fragrances are not exactly the same. And I think that is just a question of how much that fragrance means to you, how much that feeling of wearing that fragrance means to you, as to whether you would spend that extra money to buy the Tom Ford over the Dossier. Clearly, their fragrances are very, very similar. And ultimately, if you zoom out, they're exactly the same. So are there any cases where a dupe fragrance can just win out over a designer fragrance brand? Well, yes, there are. So occasions where designer fragrance brands have discontinued a fragrance, there is no other option to buy that fragrance unless you can find it secondhand. And really, when a fragrance has been discontinued for a long time, designer fragrances get very, very expensive very quickly, and they also get really hard to find. Just look at Alien Essence Absolute and the number of copies that are on that market, and it's just a minefield. I would much rather go and buy a clone fragrance of Alien Essence Absolute than search for a bottle of it again. I have now got a bottle, and wow, it was an ordeal, and it took me years to find one at a reasonable cost. But you know, that's just something that you have to do, isn't it? If you want that fragrance, then you have to be patient. I guess another case of this would be something that was duping Misty or Cherie. That would be something that you just couldn't get at an affordable cost. Another instance where dupes might win out is if they improve something about that fragrance. So if they improve the longevity, or if they improve the projection or the sillage of the fragrance, then that fragrance might be just more attractive to the general public, as opposed to the fragrance brand's original fragrance. Another thing would be if they improve the batch-to-batch variation. So notoriously, Creed's Aventus is absolutely a minefield with its different batches. And people debate all the time which is the best batch of Creed Aventus and which is the original version and which one you should go for. And you know, there are entire forums dedicated to Creed Aventus batch codes. But ultimately, if a clone brand produce a great version of Creed Aventus, then that's a more reliable source than chancing it with an original Creed. And finally, of course, there's really the biggest reason why dupe fragrances can win out over fragrance brands, and that's just price point. It's just cheaper in general to buy a clone fragrance than it is to buy an original fragrance. That's just the way it is. So finally, what's the future of fragrance clones? Do we think they're going to stick around in the future? Are they going to be even more popular? I think actually high street stores stocking fragrances like Zara that are clearly inspired by or even verging on the clone fragrance market is something that is really making clone fragrances more acceptable to the general public. The future of fragrance really might transform entirely with the advent of AI as well, because AI might actually dispense with the idea of a perfumer. AI might be the way fragrances are developed in future, and ultimately AI is very much more akin to the way that clone fragrances are made than the way that branded fragrances are made nowadays. So that's a really interesting point to end on, and I just would like to know your opinion. Do you think perfume is art? Is that how you see fragrance? Or do you think it's more just a product? And do you think that a smell in any shape or form could be at one day something that could be copyrighted or trademarked? I'd be really interested to know. Also, have you tried any clone brands, and which ones do you rate? Which ones should I try? Do you think it's morally wrong to copy other people's fragrances? Please let me know down below, and also thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, then please press the like button, and please also consider subscribing if you haven't done already, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!